They told us it would be glory. That's the word the recruiters used back in Manchester when they pressed the Queen's shilling into my palm. Glory, honor, and steady pay. As if that coin could wash the soot out of my lungs from factory work or put meat on my family's table. Truth is, I didn't join the army for Queen or country. I joined because there wasn't much else left for the likes of me. Work was scarce, food scarcer, and a uniform was at least a ticket out of the gutter. The voyage south was miserable. A cramped, stinking ship stuffed with men who'd never set foot outside their villages. Half of us were seasick the whole way. The rest passed the time gambling away their pay. The officers stayed above deck, of course, sipping their rum and pretending the rest of us didn't exist. By the time we sighted the coast of Africa, the hold reeked like a slaughterhouse. Sweat, piss, and unwashed bodies. When the sun rose over Natal, I thought for a moment that maybe the stories of glory weren't all lies. The land looked beautiful from a distance. Rolling green hills, a sky wider than any I'd ever seen. But the moment we set foot ashore, Africa showed us her teeth. The air was hot and wet, like breathing through a damp rag. Flies swarmed our faces, mosquitoes drank us raw, and men collapsed in the heat before we'd even marched a mile. I remember thinking, if this is paradise, God can keep it. The camp was a patch of mud and canvas. We drilled under the sun until our heads swam. The food was weevilled biscuit and salty beef, tough enough to break a tooth. And always, the officers barking about discipline while they dined on better rations. They called it service to the empire. We called it misery with a red coat. The talk among the ranks was all about the Zulus. Some said they were half-naked savages who'd scatter at the sound of a rifle. Others whispered they were disciplined, fierce, and had already carved up tribes 10 times our number. I didn't know what to believe, but I could see the fear in the eyes of the veterans, men who'd fought in India and Afghanistan. They didn't laugh when the Zulu were mentioned. I told myself I'd survive Africa, one way or another. I'd seen enough hunger back home to know death doesn't always come with a spear. It comes slow, through poverty. So I shouldered my rifle, cursed the sun, and marched on with the rest. Little did I know, the land itself wasn't the worst enemy waiting for us. If I close my eyes even now, I can still feel it. The African sun burning the back of my neck until the skin peeled. The sweat soaking my tunic so bad it stank worse than a tannery. The land seemed to hate us, as if it knew we didn't belong. It wasn't just the heat. It was everything. The ground cracked your boots open, the rivers swarmed with fever, and the very air carried sickness. Before a Zulu spear had ever touched a single one of us, Africa was thinning our ranks. Men dropped from sunstroke on the marches, their faces red as boiled lobsters, tongues swollen and useless. We had no pity for them. We just stepped over and kept moving. You learned quickly in that place that weakness was contagious. At night, the coughing started. Some men hacked so hard they spat blood, and the surgeon said it was just camp fever. Camp fever. Such a neat name for a slow death. If the dysentery didn't take you, the mosquitoes would. I woke most mornings covered in bites, scratching until I bled. Some lads swore they could hear the whine of those little devils even in their dreams. The food was worse than the insects. Hard biscuit that turned to dust in your mouth. Salted beef you could hammer a nail with. We joked that the biscuit had been baked in the time of Julius Caesar, and the beef had seen service at Waterloo. But hunger isn't a thing to laugh at for long. I saw men fight over scraps thrown from the officers' table, scraps that wouldn't have fed a dog. The officers, of course, never went hungry. They had crates of wine, jars of jam, tinned meat, and cigars. They dined under their canvas awnings, and we sat in the mud with our wormy bread. Empire, they called it. Empire tasted like rot and salt. And then there was the marching, endless marching. Miles upon miles under that merciless sun, packs cutting into your shoulders, boots rubbing the skin off your feet. A mile feels like 10 when the sun's hammering down, and every step kicks dust into your mouth. Some days I wondered if the Zulu would even need to fight us. We'd collapse into our own graves before their spears touched us. I used to think England was cruel, the smoke, the cold, the hunger. But Africa was a different cruelty. England starved you slow. Africa broke you quick. By the time I first saw a Zulu with my own eyes, I was half a ghost already. You could always tell when the officers were lying. Their voices got louder, and their moustaches twitched. They'd swagger around camp, telling us the Zulus were savages, nothing more than barefoot tribesmen who'd melt away once they heard the crack of a Martini Henry rifle. A disciplined line will send them running, they'd say. But at night, when the fire was low and the sentries were posted, the whispers told a different tale. Men who'd scouted ahead swore they'd seen them. Thousands of warriors, their shields shining like black mirrors in the sun, spears catching the light like stars. They marched in lines, not the rabble we'd been promised, but ordered, drilled. Some veterans muttered the word Impi, the Zulu regiment. And when they spoke it, their voices dropped low, as if the word itself had teeth. The first time I saw one, I nearly dropped my rifle. We were foraging near a stream when a Zulu scout appeared on the ridge, watching us. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a shield of ox hide and a short stabbing spear in his hand. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there like a statue carved out of the land itself. We froze, a half-dozen of us, too scared even to raise our rifles. And then, without a sound, he was gone, as if the earth had swallowed him. That night, every snapping twig sounded like a war cry. Every shadow was a Zulu creeping in with his spear. I couldn't sleep, not with my heart pounding like a drum. We posted extra guards, but it didn't matter. Fear had already marched into camp and set up its own tent. Some men tried bravado. They'd boast about how many Zulu they'd shoot, how the Martini Henry could drop a man at 400 yards. But their hands shook as they cleaned their rifles, and you could see it in their eyes. They weren't fooling anyone. Others turned to prayer, mumbling hymns before bed. Me, I just cursed the army, cursed Africa, cursed the day I ever took the shilling. The officers laughed at our nerves, but I noticed they kept their pistols closer at hand. They might call the Zulu savages, but deep down, they knew what we were up against. I learned something in those days. The waiting is worse than the fighting. A bullet or a spear, that comes quick. But waiting for an enemy you can't see, hearing the drums on the wind, wondering if tonight's the night they rush the camp that eats at your soul. By the time the battle came, some of us were half mad already. The march to Isandlwana was supposed to be routine, just another camp set up, Another day of blistered feet and cursed rations. That's what the officers told us anyway. But I'd learned by then not to trust a word they said. The column stretched for miles, a crawling red snake across the veldt. Wagons groaned under supplies, oxen stumbled, and the men shuffled along with heads bent low against the sun. We were tired before we'd even begun. The heat pressed down like a hammer. The dust rose in clouds that choked your throat, and every step rattled through your bones. My boots had worn through at the soles, and I'd stuffed them with grass to keep from bleeding. Each mile felt like a punishment. If this was glory, it had a cruel sense of humor. The officers, of course, rode on horseback. They barked orders from the saddle, clean uniforms gleaming, pistols polished. They looked like parade ground heroes. We looked like scarecrows in red cloth, stumbling through hell. And all the while, they spoke of how the Zulu would never dare meet us in open battle. "They'll scatter like sheep," one lieutenant laughed. I remember thinking, if he was right, why did the veterans keep sharpening their bayonets every night, as if expecting them to taste blood? We reached Isandlwana, a strange hill rising out of the plain like the back of some ancient beast. The camp was pitched at its base, tents scattered wide, wagons lined like toy blocks. It looked almost careless, as if no enemy would ever dream of touching us. The officers rode about with their usual swagger, but among the ranks there was a muttering unease. No laager of wagons, no trenches dug, no strong defences raised. Just canvas, mud, and misplaced confidence. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, out on picket duty, I'd swear I saw figures in the tall grass, shadows that vanished when you blinked. The Zulu were out there. We all knew it. The air carried their presence, heavy and sharp as the edge of a blade. But the officers laughed at the idea. "Savages don't understand tactics," they told us. "They'll never face the might of the empire head-on." We believed them because we had to. Belief was all we had to keep marching. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew something was wrong. The land was too quiet, the sky too wide. It felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the slaughter to begin. It began with a shout. One of the scouts came tearing back into camp, his horse frothing, eyes wide as cannonballs. "They're coming!" he screamed. Before the officers could hush him, the horns of the Zulu sounded across the plain, a low, rolling thunder that made the ground itself tremble. I'll never forget the sight. At first it was just dust rising in the distance, a haze against the horizon. Then they appeared, lines upon lines, shields flashing, spears glinting in the sun. Not a rabble, not a mob, but a tide of warriors moving as one. The impi. The officers had said they would scatter. Instead, they advanced like a black storm, silent but for the drums and the pounding of their feet. "Form up!" the sergeants bellowed. We scrambled into firing lines, rifles shaking in our hands. My mouth was dry as sand. The first volley cracked, smoke belched, and men cheered when a few Zulu fell. For a moment, it felt as though maybe the officers were right, that our firepower would hold. But then the tide surged forward, faster, closer, filling the gaps with more bodies than we could ever drop. The Martini Henry was a fine rifle, but it wasn't magic. Cartridges jammed in the heat, barrels scorched our hands, and the sheer number of them, God the number, was like trying to stop the ocean with a bucket. They fanned out, horns of a great beast curling around our flanks, swallowing us whole. I remember the sound most of all, the crash of rifles, the screams of the wounded, the Zulu war cry rising like thunder. Men broke ranks, some firing wildly, others throwing down their rifles and running. Officers shouted themselves hoarse, but their words were lost in the storm. Then they were among us, spears stabbing, shields battering, the air filled with blood and smoke. I fired until my rifle jammed, then swung it like a club. A Zulu came at me, eyes blazing, spear thrust low. I parried with the butt of my rifle, felt the shock rattle through my bones, and somehow stumbled free. Around me, friends I'd marched with for months were cut down like wheat. I don't know how I escaped. Some instinct, some blind panic carried my legs away from that cursed hill. I ran until my lungs burned, until the screams faded behind me. I looked back once, just once, and saw Isandlwana swallowed in smoke and death, red coats scattered like broken dolls across the veldt. We'd thought ourselves the masters of empire. That day, we learned what arrogance costs. I reached Rorke's Drift with my legs barely under me, more ghost than man. Word of the slaughter at Isandlwana had flown ahead of us like a plague, and when I stumbled into that little mission station, just a handful of buildings and a hospital, I could see the terror in every man's eyes. We were a scrap of survivors, clinging to a patch of dirt while the Zulu tide gathered again. The officers didn't speak of retreat. Retreat meant being run down in the open, spears in your back before you'd taken 20 steps. So we set to work fortifying what we could. Mealie bags stacked chest high, biscuit boxes dragged into walls, wagon wheels jammed into gaps. It looked pitiful, really, a child's fortress against a hurricane. But it was all we had, and we worked as if our lives depended on it. Because they did. By sundown, the first shadows came over the ridge, thousands of them. They moved quick, silent, like hunters circling prey. My hands shook as I rammed a cartridge home. The officer shouted the order, and the first volley cracked across the plain. The Zulu fell, but more came on. Always more. The night that followed was madness. They charged again and again, throwing themselves against our little barricades, climbing, hacking, thrusting with those short spears. We fired until our shoulders ached, until our rifles fouled with powder. Smoke choked the air, lit only by muzzle flashes and the glow of burning thatch when they set the hospital alight. I'll never forget the screams from inside. Men too wounded to fight, roasted alive as the flames took them. I found myself fighting, not with a rifle, but with my bayonet, jabbing at dark shapes that leapt over the bags. Their eyes were fierce, their strength terrifying. More than once I thought my guts would be spilled there in the dirt, but somehow we held. Every time they broke through, we shoved them back with steel and desperation. The hours dragged like years. My arms felt like lead, my mouth full of ash and blood. Around me, men dropped, some dead, some screaming, but still the line held. We were past fear by then, past thought, just animals fighting for the right to see another dawn. And then, as the first grey light crept over the hills, they were gone. Just like that. The plain, once alive with war cries, lay silent, littered with bodies. We'd survived the night, but at what cost? I was too numb to cheer, too hollow to feel pride. All I could think was, this was only one night. Africa had many more waiting for us. We were called heroes after Rorke's drift. That's what the newspapers back home wrote anyway. Defenders of the Empire, lions of Britain, all that nonsense. If only they'd smelled the place the morning after. The air was thick with blood, powder smoke, and the stink of burning flesh. The ground was carpeted with corpses, flies already settling in like royalty at a feast. Heroes, they called us. We felt more like survivors of a plague. We buried who we could, but there were too many, and the earth too shallow. The sun cooked the rest where they lay, and soon the air buzzed with rot. Men vomited as they worked, gagging behind their sleeves, but still the stench clung to us. You couldn't eat without tasting it, couldn't sleep without dreaming of it. Africa had a way of seeping into your skin and never letting go. Then came the fever. It swept through the camp like wildfire. Men who had faced Zulu spears without flinching were now curled up in the dirt, shivering, their eyes yellow with sickness. Dysentery took others, leaving them hollowed out and pale, begging for water that only made it worse. The surgeons did what they could, bloodletting, quinine, prayers, but the grave kept filling. The rations, bad as they were before, grew worse still. Biscuit alive with weevils, meat green around the edges. We joked bitterly that the maggots were the only fresh food we'd see. Water was no better, muddy, crawling with things that wriggled in your cup. You drank it anyway, because thirst killed faster than disease. Letters came sometimes, thin sheets of paper smudged with the touch of home. I remember one lad, Thomas from Liverpool, reading a letter from his wife by firelight. He smiled for the first time in months. The next morning, he was dead from fever, the letter folded in his hand. They buried him with it, still clutched tight, as if it might guide him somewhere better than this cursed land. The officers kept up their talk of honour and duty, but it rang hollow. What honour was there in watching your mates rot from the inside out? What duty in hauling corpses by the dozen into pits? Some men prayed louder, some cursed louder. Most just stared into nothing, their eyes empty. I'd thought the battle was the worst of it. I was wrong. A bullet or spear ends you quick. Fever, rot, hunger. Those drag you down slow, day after day, until you forget what it feels like to be alive. If there's one thing the army taught me in Africa, it's that a man can be marched to death just as easily as speared. Day after day, mile after mile, we trudged across that cursed veldt, the sun hammering us flat, and the dust filling our mouths. You'd think after Rorke's drift they might have given us rest. But the Empire doesn't rest, it grinds, and we were the teeth of its millstones. The marches blurred into one another. At dawn we were kicked awake, sore and half-starved. By noon, the heat baked us till our brains rattled in our skulls. By night, we collapsed where we stood, too tired to dream. Our boots shredded our feet until they were raw meat. I bound mine with rags, but the blood still seeped through. The officers, safe in their saddles, called it discipline. We called it torment. The Zulu knew how to fight without fighting. They didn't need to meet us in pitched battle. They bled us with ambushes. A picket would vanish in the tall grass. A wagon train struck in the dark. You'd march past a kopje, think nothing of it, and suddenly spears would rain down. A few men gone in a flash, and by the time we'd formed up, they'd melted away into the hills. Ghosts in the landscape, everywhere and nowhere at once. It wore on the nerves worse than open combat. Desertion crept into the ranks. A few slipped away each week, running for the coast or into the hills. Most never made it. The officers caught one poor bastard from Birmingham, trying to sneak out under cover of night. They flogged him bloody in front of us all, then hanged him from a wagon wheel as a warning. His body swayed for days until the sun blackened it and the vultures tore it apart. That was the lesson. Fear the empire more than the enemy. Food grew scarcer. The beef turned to rot before it ever reached us, and the biscuit crumbled to dust. Some men boiled strips of leather just to fill their bellies. Others stole from the dead. I can't blame them. I did worse myself. Hunger gnaws louder than conscience. What struck me hardest wasn't just the hardship, but the way it became routine. At first you curse every blister, every bite, every damned order. Then one day you wake, and the pain feels normal. You forget there was ever another life. Africa had made beasts of us. Silent, plodding, half-dead beasts dragging rifles through endless dust. And still, the Zulu watched. We could feel them in the hills, in the tall grass, in our very dreams, waiting for the moment to strike again. By the time we marched on Ulundi, we were shadows of men. Lean, ragged, hollow-eyed. The officers still spoke of honor, of teaching the Zulu a final lesson. But for us it wasn't about victory. It was about survival. We wanted it ended, one way or another. Some prayed for a bullet just to be free of the endless marches, the rot, the dust. The column moved heavy with reinforcements, cannon, Gatling guns, and more rifles than I'd ever seen in one place. The Empire had been embarrassed at Isandlwana, and now it meant to prove its strength. You could smell the arrogance in the air, brass buttons polished, drums beating as if we were on parade. But beneath the pomp was something else too, fear. Even with all that firepower, every man knew what the Zulu could do. When they came as they always did. Sudden, terrible, filling the plain with their horns. Tens of thousands, shields flashing, war cries rolling like thunder. I swear the ground shook beneath their feet. For a moment, I thought of Isandlwana again. Thought we were about to be swallowed alive. But this time the Empire had learned. We formed a square, a great bristling box of rifles and guns. The cannon opened first, tearing gaps in their ranks, hurling men into the air. Then the Gatlings, spitting death in streams. Our rifles cracked in volleys, line after line, until the smoke lay thick as a fog. Still they came, charging, leaping, some breaking through, only to be met with bayonets and pistol fire. I can't call it a battle. It was slaughter. The Zulu fought with a fury I've never seen before or since, men hurling themselves into the storm, knowing full well what waited. Brave doesn't even begin to describe it. They deserved more than the roar of our guns. But bravery means little against metal and fire. By afternoon, the plain was carpeted with bodies, the cries faded to silence, and Ulundi burned. The officers cheered. They called it a triumph. The Zulu kingdom was broken, they said. The empire secured. Medals would be minted, songs sung, names etched into history. I felt nothing. No triumph, no pride, just emptiness. I'd seen too many faces staring sightless at the sky, too many good men buried in shallow graves, too many enemies cut down like wheat. Victory meant nothing in a land that ate men whole. That night, as the fires of Ulundi crackled, I wondered if the Empire had won, or if we'd only lost something we'd never get back. They told us the war was over after Ulundi. The Zulu king broken, his armies scattered, his lands swallowed up by the Empire. We'd done our duty, they said. We'd brought civilization to Africa, as though civilization could be hammered out of the barrel of a gun. The officers went home to parades and promotions, medals pinned to their chests, speeches ringing with praise. Some even wrote books, painting themselves as heroes of empire. As for the likes of me, a month's pay, a pat on the back, and a berth on the ship north. That was the Empire's gratitude. No medals, no speeches, just scars that ached in the rain and nightmares that never left. I came back leaner, older, and not half the man I'd been. The streets of Manchester hadn't changed, but I had. The smoke still choked the sky, children still begged barefoot in the alleys, women still scraped by on pennies. Glory hadn't followed me home. Hunger had. The army pension was barely enough for bread. No one wanted to hear about Africa, about the heat, the fever, the faces of dead lads rotting under the sun. They wanted stories of heroics, of banners waving in victory. And when I didn't give them that, they turned away. Sometimes, late at night, I see their faces, the lads who never came back. Thomas with his wife's letter, Collins who died of fever, Jenkins who vanished in the grass at Isandlwana, never seen again. They're with me still, marching beside me in the dark. And the Zulu too. I see their eyes, fierce and unbroken, even as our guns tore them down. We called them savages, but I tell you this, they had more courage in one charge than the Empire ever gave us in a lifetime. What was it all for? A patch of land on a map, a line drawn by men who'd never felt the African sun scorch their necks. The Empire stretches a little further, and 1,000 graves are left behind. That's the arithmetic of glory. I survived Africa, but Africa never let me go. The heat, the hunger, the stink of death, it clings to me still, in my bones, in my dreams. I am a forgotten man from a forgotten war, and my only medal is the knowledge that I walked through hell and came out the other side. Not victorious, not proud, just alive. And sometimes that feels like no victory at all.